Welcome to this post-lunch session. We deliberately kept it with Sai Deepak, knowing full well that all of you will come back post-lunch. So, Sai Deepak, thank you for a second book of equally interesting and disturbing information, just as the first one was. I think what you exemplify is new perspectives to old facts that we already know. So I will not present what the book is all about. I think that will emerge in the course of the talk. So in your first book, you basically talked about the impact of European coloniality on our consciousness. And me being an urban Indian city dweller, obviously it made me think a lot, especially since I teach the Enlightenment and I had to give a completely different gaze to it. This time you have decided to look at similar timelines, but you have delved into Islamic, Muslim, Middle Eastern coloniality, as you call it. So, first of all, why did you find it necessary to, what is the perspective that you wanted us to change or reset in our minds by delving into this subject in the second volume?
Since you have read the book, what did you make of my intention as the reader?
Well, the fact is that if you are aware of what's happening in India today, then these are the questions that you've addressed in the second book give certain answers and indications as to why, where we are going with certain policies, where we are going with certain ideologies, and the consequences that the majority is facing. So it really helps in understanding that. So the preparation to what we are today is, I think, what you have. But why am I answering this question?
Did you see a parallel between the past and the present? Did you?
Yes, I do, and that's my last question to you, in fact.
That was the intention.
Okay. So
that was precisely the intention.
Okay.
Because the idea was not to indulge in any kind of an academic exercise. By the time I was done with the chapter on Mopla riots, and while I was going through the material, I consciously stayed away from my family. So my family lives in the first 2 floors. I live on the 3rd floor in my office. And
is it loud enough?
Yes.
Huh.
I avoided meeting them because I know for a fact that the material was filling me with a lot of purpose and, let's call it, dark energy. And the idea was to see if there is a way that I could transmit what I was feeling to the audience. Not necessarily the dark energy, but that sense of purpose. Because you had Nupur Sharma, you had Praveen Nettaru, a spate of killings in Mangalore. People are not paying attention to what is actually happening on the streets of Mangalore right now, and it is reminiscent of what was happening in 1920s. I know for a fact that a number of people who went for election rallies in Wayanad and other places, despite having police protection, had to leave the place merely because 2 or 3 boys in motorcycles with green flags would turn up and say, leave. And that's the end of the matter. And this is in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So I couldn't see a distinction in the situation, in the quality of the situation. Perhaps I would actually go to the extent of saying that it is even worse at this point, simply because of the self-imposed fetters that we have as a community put on our ability to speak about the truth. And second, I think that the current dispensation is making the very same mistakes as the Congress of the 1920s.
So, if we go to the beginning of the book, there are 2 things that you discuss. One is the Muslim movement to purity. There are 2 interesting contradictions, in my opinion, that drive it. One is a sense of massive insecurity of the loss of power. And second is somehow a certain entitled notion that they were the rulers and they need to rule back. So that is a movement that drives it. And the second one is the impact of English education. So on the one hand, you have an entire brood of clerks, non-thinking moderates who emerge out of this English education. And on the same hand, you sort of attribute exposure to English education to a certain revival of nationalism. And then can you please explain to us as to why the Muslim community were late in catching on to English education and why they did it? Because their motives are very different. So if you can explain these two.
So one of the things that I was trying to showcase in the second book, so the first book effectively lays out a broad thesis in terms of what is the impact of European coloniality on Indian minds. But that would be a very monolithic approach to the entire situation, because obviously the two-nation theory was a reality on the ground, which means both the nations, meaning the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, were receiving this English education very differently. Hindus, I would say a significant portion of them, those who embraced English education, were doing so to climb the social ladder, and also they had refashioned their own approach to dharma on Protestant lines. The Brahmo movement being significantly one of those examples, according to me. And therefore, they wanted to perhaps do away with those aspects of their culture which they felt held them back from being a part of the new modern civilized world. And they had almost no conviction in the metaphysical, let's say, foregrounding of Hinduism. And they were happy to be a part of this elite club. Now, Muslims consciously stayed away from English education, perhaps because they were acutely aware of education's role in transmission of culture, including the role played by language. And in that sense, Muslims were sharper, better informed, shrewder, and far-sighted in not embracing English education. And they stayed away from it significantly. And this was a conscious call which clerics and families issued to their own children, saying, do not embrace it under any circumstances. Should it come to that, start with Islamic learning and then go to English learning. And that is the hybrid model that Sai Deepak comes out with. So the one is the question of the means. The second is the end goal. Hindus, represented by the Congress, represented by the moderates, were interested in being part of the English empire. They make no bones of it. They're absolutely clear about it. Anyone who aspired for freedom and complete independence was branded a lunatic who should have been committed to a mental institution, according to them. These were statements issued by Gokhale and others, the political mentor of Gandhi. And these statements were not isolated statements. This broadly represented the DNA of the Congress until the emergence of the extremist faction within the Congress. And since the extremist faction was effectively marginalized and relegated to the sidelines, the moderates represented the mainstream of the Congress. So a dominion status or a status at par with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, this was the end goal of the Congress. Whereas Muslims were clear, and Sai Deepak says it abundantly clearly, where he says, I am no fan of the British man or his culture, but I need his help to prevent the resurgence of Hindu political rise. And I need his help to ensure that members of my community infiltrate the system using English, but not drowning in the ocean called English culture. And that was effectively the ball that he set rolling. And I think that ball continues to roll even in 2023.
Now, between Syed Ahmad Khan and the brief role played by Afghani, I think that is capital, because in the events that will ensue, especially with the very first, not even the First World War, preceding the First World War, the very first skirmishes that Italy has with Libya,
right.
You have this spirit of pan-Islamism that is almost, it's guttural, it's woven in the DNA.
Right.
So between Syed Ahmad Khan's vision and Afghani's attempt to put in, like, can you explain to us up until then, if in the revivalism, purity, was pan-Islamism a part? And what exactly happened with maybe the tottering of the Ottoman Empire that gave this absolutely visceral anger in the Muslims towards pan-Islamism?
So you see, this is an interesting question in the backdrop of the current government's celebration of the Khilafat movement as part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. When you read the history of this particular period, it is positively embarrassing for anybody to celebrate the Khilafat movement as part of Bharat's move towards independence. First of all, it wasn't an independence movement. In any case, if you do have to celebrate it, what is the point of co-opting this manifestly pan-Islamist movement? I don't understand. So there are 3 or 4 key figures who emerge around that particular period, which is until 1898. I think in September or November when Sai Deepak Khan passes away. So you're looking at a period between 1830s to 1898. Now, the 2 key figures, one international and one national, who collide and who perhaps ought to have collaborated are Sayyid Jamal al-Din Afghani and Syed Ahmad Khan. So Afghani happens to be one of the foremost Muslim intellectuals of the 19th century, who is significantly responsible for rekindling pan-Islamism from Egypt to Turkey to Bharat. And his stay in Bharat is not understood enough. And his stay in Delhi and Calcutta and in the seminary called Madrasa Rahmiya of Dehlavi, which is also the alma mater of Syed Ahmad Khan, is not understood enough. Now this man effectively says that in order for Islam to revive itself, the concept of a caliphate must be re-established. Now he tries to somehow rekindle the fire in Egypt. You have to remember that before Turkey became the center for Islamic caliphate, it was Egypt. So the Mamluk dynasty loses to the Ottomans, and then the caliphate passes on from Egypt to Turkey. And then they become vassals of Turkey in a particular sense. That entire region is governed by Ottomans through their governorates. Now the French and English establishments are desperately trying to install their puppets in Egypt. So there is a fight that goes on between Muslim nationalists of Egypt and that particular region and the collaborators of the British. Ultimately, the collaborators win. Afghani is responsible for leading student protests in Egypt around that particular period. So once the collaborator comes to power, he kicks him out. So this man is an itinerant, moves from Egypt, goes to Afghanistan, tries to rekindle Islamism through the Emir of Afghanistan, doesn't succeed there because the British kick him out. So from there he comes to Bombay, spends time here. From here he goes to Turkey. And he lands in Turkey, dies in Turkey ultimately. He is imprisoned by the Ottoman Sultan and he dies there. But before he goes, he spends a significant amount of period trying to understand the role that the Indian Muslim population can perhaps play in the revival of the caliphate. And he does a fantastic analysis of it. His stay is significantly responsible for mainstreaming Wahhabism further, which was already a fairly mainstream strain of Islamic thought in this country, and the importance, integrality, essentiality, and criticality of jihad in the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate. He reinforces it brilliantly. And his students are the first education minister of this country, Maulana Azad, along with the founders of JUI. I think Maulana Madani spoke a few days ago, calling Islam the oldest religion in the world and that Bharat is apparently the home of Islam. That's his statement now. So these organizations effectively learned from Afghani, because you see his publication. So he gets kicked out from here, he goes to Turkey. Before he goes to Turkey, he spends a brief period in France. Now, France decided to shelter all those people who were working against the British, like Pondicherry. Okay. So, like Subramania Bharati worked from here, Afghani worked from France. And so he comes out with publications. Now, those publications are banned in Bharat. But somehow those newspapers and those publications find their way to Islamic institutions here, and they read and they say, this man has given a fantastic way forward in terms of a map as to how do we rekindle and revive the Muslim establishment of the world. And then they start working here actively. This is just before the Khilafat movement. This is just before the outbreak of the First World War. And once the First World War starts, then the divided loyalties start. Now, what is the role of Syed Ahmad Khan and what are his interactions with Afghani? Syed Ahmad Khan until then is effectively seen as the intellectual leader of Muslims in Bharat because he is showing them a fantastic way. He has established a brilliant institution by way of the MAO, which hadn't become Aligarh by then. It was renamed as Aligarh only in 1920. So he says, he's basically telling Indian Muslims, do not concern yourself with pan-Islamism or with what's happening in Turkey, because you have to deal with the realities of your existence, which is to keep the Hindu away from power as much as possible. And in order for you to do that, you need to collaborate with the English. So do not take an anti-English position here. And if you start interfering with the power struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the English Empire, you are endangering your position here, has been his position. So when this man comes here, Afghani comes here, he effectively calls out Syed Ahmad Khan as a British collaborator. And he says, you don't have the confidence in the Quran, you don't have the confidence in Hadith, you don't have confidence, you are effectively a believer of natural law. He writes a book where he coins this derogative word called natury, which is, it's an Urdufication of the English word, which is anybody who believes in natural law is called a natury. So he writes a huge criticism of these people, saying these are Darwinists who are anti-Quranists, so on and so forth. And this fight effectively decides the way forward for the Indian Muslim population's, course of action. Syed Ahmad Khan, according to me, lost this battle. For two reasons. This was almost close to the fag end of his life. And Afghani was relatively young. I think the man died before he turned 60. In his mid-50s, he died. And this man came in with a lot of vigor. And all those people who felt that the pace with which Ahmad Khan's vision wasn't taking effect got a lot of, let's call it, they got the right kind of kick that was needed through Afghani's sermons here. And then when he goes to Turkey, in his detailed exposition to the Turkish Sultan, he explains the role that Afghani Muslims and Indian Muslims will play in establishing the caliphate, because they have numbers, they have educated Muslims from the Bengalis, they also have money, and they are in perhaps control of among the largest swathes of land possible. So considering this tussle decides the way forward, and this immediately precedes the outbreak of the Khilafat movement. Okay? So I think that period needs to be understood better. Subsequently, the Aligarh movement, realizing that it's falling behind because of Afghani's influence, also adopts the very same course of action. So this is what happens. And Hindus were doing Bhajan Mandali for the British all this while.
So this is there are two strains you follow. So this is the Muslim strain in the book. The other one is initially, let's call it the Congress before it splits. That is, as you explain, is actually a safety valve to contain and give a channel of opinion expression to the nationalist movement that was burgeoning at the moment.
Correct.
Okay. So now contrast this with 1885 to 1905 and the achievements of Congress therein. And the realization of the revolutionaries of 1905 and what the Muslims achieved between the establishment of the Muslim League and the concessions given to them in the Morley Minto reforms. You know, just give us the timeline so that we understand exactly what was achieved in 20 years and what was achieved in 2 years and how.
So you're looking at the establishment of three different organizations. Congress under the leadership and under his vision in 1885. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental Education Conference, which was established in 1887 by Syed Ahmad Khan. Then December 1905, 1905? Yeah, it's 1905 is when, 1906 is when Muslim League is established in Dhaka. Now from 1885 to the Surat split of 1807 between the Naramdal and the Garamdal, the Congress is doing only two things. Give us more representation in the bureaucracy. Give us more representation in the bureaucracy. We want more sane policy making. And ensure that the examinations that are held for the civil services between England and India are the same, the pattern is the same, the syllabus is the same, everything is the same. That's all they were fighting for, nothing beyond. The fight between 1885 until 1905 was for greater representation in the bureaucracy to be a part of the colonial administrative infrastructure and gradually moving towards Swaraj. And Swaraj was defined as staying within the confines of the empire as its dominion. Between 1901 and 1905 or 1906 is when you see a serious emergence of the then right wing, or at least the extremist faction, by way of Bal Ganga, the Lal Balpal trio, and then you have Sri Aurobindo, and then you have Annie Besant, so on and so forth, who said that, what are we fighting for here? To ride on the coattails of the British, or are we trying to regain our own Sanskriti? What is it that we want here ultimately? So there is a very clear fight here, which is why I would call them perhaps the forerunners of Indian decolonial thought in that particular sense. Of course, I know that the word decoloniality pricks quite a few, but still. I think this is how
in your defense, you've defined it very well in your book.
I've been fairly clear about it. I think some people are just resorting to mischievous interpretation. So the point is that they wanted to base the entire movement on Bharatiya ethos and civilizational ethos. And they were very clear that this mirage called Hindu-Muslim unity would never be achieved, and even if it is achieved, it would come at the expense of our interests and to the advantage of their interests. Lala Lajpat Rai was very, very clear about it. His article on the case for Hindu nationalism is a must read. And despite being, perhaps as an Arya Samaji, how he felt about it, he is very, very clear about it. Now, so until 1905, this is what they do. But the emergence of the extremists, who ended up becoming the thought leaders for the revolutionaries, such as Tilak for that matter, who perhaps may have also be hand in glove with the assassins of Scott, I think, the Chapekar brothers, who killed the plague commissioner in Pune for his mishandling of the bubonic plague in Pune. Now, while this was happening, for the first time, people realize that they've been fooled by the Congress, which is seen as a status quoist organization and which is interested in being a sharer or a stakeholder in power with the British, and beyond that they had no aspirations. And since even that movement was really slow at a snail's pace, it's the extremists who start getting a lot of support along with the revolutionaries, and they are the ones who are significantly responsible for pushing the Overton window. So the definition of independence or Swaraj is changed. The move towards saying that it's not about being a part of this establishment, we want them to get out of the place. And that conversation finally gets aired from the platform of the Congress for the very first time. Now, we have to be very careful about branding every member of the Congress as a collaborator, because unfortunately or fortunately, that happened to be the only significant political tent under which people could air their views. And since it enjoyed a certain degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the British, those who wanted independence too thought that they could actually be a part of this particular platform and push their agenda. So it was a big tent in that particular sense. Now, while all of this was happening, Muslims effectively see Congress as a Hindu organization, which the Congress never was. It was at pains to say we are a secular organization. Do not perceive us through the prism of the extremists or the nationalists, because it's a minority, it's a fringe, it's a lunatic fringe. They are cow lovers, and these are the people who are interested in preventing Go Hatya. They are the Gaurakshas of that particular period. So let us throw them under the bus. That was the position of the moderates. Now, when this happens, the Muslims effectively say the Congress has managed to create a political institution which seems to be getting a lot of traction from the British. While the Aligarh movement has done a great job of combining modern education and Islamic education, it is still a social movement, it is not a political movement. So they say we now need a political organization. And this conversation becomes sharper after the demise of Syed Ahmad Khan in 1898. So between 1898 and 1905, multiple events happen at the same time. Curzon arrives. He sees that, so he is deeply suspicious of the Congress, despite it being a collaborator organization. He says, no, these are stooges. They're double agents. You can't trust them, so on and so forth. So he says, I don't want to take a chance. I want to break that movement, and I want to break its back. And I also have enough administrative reasons to do so. And because Bengal is such a huge, sprawling province, I will have enough justifications to break it for administrative reasons. And the commissioners of Assam are also saying that in order for us to use the port of Assam for tea export and whatnot, Calcutta's primacy as the port needs to be brought down, and therefore let's break it away. And only then the railway tracks that have been laid in Assam and other places will actually find economic value. How do we otherwise generate the ROI for the investment made in the railways in Assam and other places? So this is effectively the calculation there. And he makes an active pitch to the Muslims of Eastern Bengal and Assam. Your Mughalistan will be back under us. For the first time, you will have the Mughal flag flying after the decline of the Mughal Empire, if you were to agree to this particular partition. For 6 months, the man goes about selling that particular proposition. Almost without exception, that proposal is purchased lock, stock, and barrel by the Muslim community. And once you have offered that, so let's say olive green branch, not the olive branch, so they are ready. And they say, now is the opportunity, and they latch on to it. And they push for separate electorates. And after pushing for separate electorates, when they succeed in the Minto Morley reforms to get the separate electorates, by the end of that year, they establish the Muslim League. The pace with which the Muslim League moves after that, I would say the Congress was caught unawares. So what the Congress couldn't achieve from 1885 to 1905, Muslim League and its predecessors managed to achieve between 1905 and 1907. And this was the sharpness with which they moved, and this was the clarity with which they moved. I'm amazed. I have grudging, deep respect and admiration for what they achieved.
So one of the things that are spoken about your book is your citations. So you have a lot of quotes of parliamentary proceedings of the Morley Minto reforms. One of the things that really struck me a lot, especially because that collusion is very rife today, is that you actually had British members of parliament talking about Islam and Christianity being the religion of Abraham.
Correct.
And therefore that collusion is important.
Correct.
So can you explain that? Of course it infuriates me, it baffles me that, the so-called nation of the Enlightenment should talk and justify ceding the separate electorate and the 3/4 vote, actually citing the fact that the religions are of the same origin. So can you just, especially because this collusion affects us to this day.
Correct. So you see, after 1857, when the vast majority of the Muslim population comes under the radar for their participation, not in the independence movement, they actually wanted the revival of the Islamic flag. That much is very clear. I don't think we should even be celebrating it as the first war of independence. So there is a very clear documentation from Pakistan side of historians as well as Indian side of historians who clearly say that they were not fighting for an agnostic independence which is agnostic of religious identity and all that. They're very clear about it. Anybody who shouts Nara-e-Takbir at, let's say, in a fight is not being irreligious, because it's bound to be followed by Allahu Akbar. Okay, that is the slogan. So this was the war cry, and it's recorded in multiple places, and this was not limited only to the north of the Vindhyas. In Madras, these cries were, let's say, they joined them. Bombay, Madras, Hyderabad, and multiple places. Now, see, here's what happens. Just give me the last train of thought that you just, in the question, you said something in the question.
I talked about the collusion, the reference
I'll
of
come to
the
that.
common
Right.
origin of the religion.
So after 1857, what happens is, Syed Ahmad Khan decides to create a defense for Muslims, to say, no, we didn't participate in this. It was Ramdeen and Gangadeen who were participants in this mutiny, which is to say Hindus were responsible for it. We were not responsible for it. And then he clearly says anybody who issued a fatwa asking for jihad against the British was either an imbecile. He called Bahadur Shah Zafar a drunken idiot and an imbecile. He called all the mullahs who did this as people who did not know what Islam was and all that. So he creates the first line of defense. Then he starts saying, look, the native religion of this country is dictated by the priestly class, whereas Islam and Christianity are egalitarian, plus we are of Abrahamic origin. So there must be a handshake between both the communities, and we must form an alliance. Now, alliance is typically adversarial in nature, which is you need an adversary against whom the alliance is formed. Now, if the Christian and the Muslim are in alliance, who are they in alliance for and against is the question. Now, when they say this, he actively also starts encouraging dinners between both communities. He asks Muslims to take up reading of the Bible, to say, do a comparative study to explain how both of us are the same. And the other side also does this. When separate electorates were granted in 1906, one of the calculations that the British had was the immediate region surrounding Bharat has a lot of Muslim countries. Because you see, Turkey is right until, because it's the Ottoman Empire, you have Turkey, you have Afghanistan, you have all these countries. Therefore, in the interest of placating these interests, it's important for us to give separate electorates to Muslims. And between the two communities, they are more loyal to us. That's the clear statement that is made. So, this argument that the British was responsible for divide and rule policy or for sowing fissures, I'm sorry, it is such a Nehruvian Marxist BS. It makes really no sense. Which is why I said, if I were to, let's say, cite secondary propositions, which is to say commentaries, I would still be accused of citing someone's interpretation of it. Which is why I cited their letters and their parliamentary debates to say both of them are speaking of their common Abrahamic foundations. In which case, you are the idiot on who said they've literally, you actually have a dunce cap on your head because you constantly believe that this man is fighting with you against the British. That's not the case. Khilafat, by the time you come to that particular period, you realize, was a bargaining chip, which is to say, should you not restore the status of Turkey, we will take away Bharat from you because that is the crown jewel in the British crown.
Including orchestrating an Afghani invasion.
Correct. They specifically even suggested this. In fact, the Ali brothers with whom Mr. Gandhi had a great relationship, I don't know what was the nature of the relationship, he basically was open and he was mum when the Ali brothers also proposed the invasion of Bharat by the Emir of Afghanistan to drive away the British. Had it not been for Madan Mohan Malviya and I think Lala Lajpat Rai, Gandhi perhaps may have even agreed. Importantly, in a speech in Erode, which was delivered to an audience of Moplas, a few months before the Mopla riots, or Mopla genocide of Hindus. So, the senior Ali brother specifically says, when the Afghans come, we will fight every man who opposes the Afghans, including the Hindu. And this statement is related to Gandhi. He says nothing. And he continues with the movement after having been informed of this statement. Unbelievable.
So we have, but just before we come back to the Mopla and
We have Q&A as well, right?
No, two strains we need to talk about a little bit. One is that surely there was something that the Hindus also did right. Because as you point out, but since it's not the theme of your book, you do mention Sri Ramakrishna, you do mention Vivekananda. So what was the nature, maybe not as systematically networked, but there was something that the Hindus did right. And in continuation of that, you know, it could be considered the bedrock of the nature and the quality of the Swadeshi movement. So can you talk a little bit about that? And also, since we are already into the Khilafat, is it not evident for anybody who reads our history that while the petitions were being given to the government or while the reforms were being proposed, the fact is that during the war you had the Defense of India Act. After the war you had Rowlatt Act. Anybody who wants to see the nature of the draconian, arbitrary, inhuman ways in which the British decided they could get away with suppressing any revolt, is it not very clear by just those laws passed by the British that it's the revolutionaries actually that
Correct.
mattered?
Correct. So, two aspects. What Hindus did right,
Yeah.
I have touched upon it to a significant extent on the revolutionary strain of thought, but it will come better in the third book, where I will cover the Sangathan movement better. So the first two books are an analysis of the triggers, and the next two books would discuss the responses from the Hindu side to this. Therefore, establishment of BHU in 1916, the Sangathan movement, and then the Sangams that were happening in Kashi and other places, which gradually led to the formation of multiple organizations, the Hindu Mahasabha, so on and so forth, and its offshoots. That will come out gradually. So just to be clear, there are about 5 or 6 movements that the third book will cover. The so-called Ambedkarite movement, the Sikh movement, the Dravidian movement, the communist movement.
So I will not ask you my question on the Justice Party now.
I've just given a brief paragraph explaining what's going to happen, where I've explained the origins of the Justice Party, as well as I've sown the seed for the Sikh movement here.
Exactly.
Because all of it happens around 1920, because everybody wants a share in the pie after the separate electorates have been offered to Muslims.
Yeah.
So all of this will come later. But Hindus did something right, but where they thwarted by their own co-religionists will be the subject of the discussion in the next book. Now, the other question that you asked was on?
If you see what the laws that British
Right,
enacted.
right, correct. So if you see all the legislations that they came out with, sedition law was to go after the Wahhabis.
Yes.
But every other legislation that came out subsequently, amendments to the penal code, were primarily to curb the activities of the revolutionaries.
Absolutely.
And the revolutionaries, as Mr. Sanyal said in his previous session, I was watching it online, they did a fantastic job of pushing the window. And the kind of, I'd say, see, it's like this. Revolutionaries were isolated by 4 stakeholders: the society at large, the moderates in the Congress, the extremists who couldn't openly own their allegiance or relationships with them, the Muslims who didn't want them, and of course the British establishment. So under these circumstances, with utter isolation, the revolutionaries operated. Imagine the kind of commitment that they had to Bharat for them to operate in these circumstances. Now, Mr. Sanyal said something very interesting about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel's elder brother during the course of his talk. All you should do is this. Today, Sardar Patel looks great. Netaji looks great. All of these people look great. I would offer a simple litmus test. As long as these people were in the Congress, what was their attitude to the revolutionaries of that particular period? Did they bat for them? Did they give them intellectual cover fire? Or did they actively push for their prosecution and publicly castigate them? You will find very few Congress leaders who are not guilty of one of these things. And that would include the person whose Statue of Unity has been built in Gujarat. His letters will clearly show what he thought of the revolutionaries. So today, because we have Nehru and Gandhi as the soft targets, anyone who represents an opposition to them becomes someone worthy of co-option. But if you want to actually look at the, let's say, the history of that particular period better, revolutionaries represent, according to me, perhaps the purest strain of thought which comes close to Bharat's civilizational ethos, where I would say they kept the Kshatriya spirit alive. Every legislation, in fact, even prior to the 1919 Act, there's a huge report that comes out on seditious crimes. They hold the Brahmins of Maharashtra singularly responsible for fomenting revolutionary activity in Maharashtra, because he says, you see, the Maratha Empire was ultimately governed or finally governed by the Peshwas. Peshwas were Brahmins, so it's the Brahmin who is trying to revive his political status. And Tilak is a Chitpavan Brahmin. So this is how the discussion happens. It's not just about the religious identity, it is now the caste identity that comes out very clearly. And if you look at the enumeration of the trouble that they caused, and the report that actually is prepared, Punjab, Maharashtra, Bengal, across the country, and even in the south, astounding. So this was never a peaceful movement. It's a peaceful representation of an otherwise violent movement that was going on parallelly. And you have to realize that the revolutionaries were not even getting support from the press. Even the local press was pro-Congress, which is why they were forced to come out with their own mouthpieces. The Anushilan Samiti had to start publishing its own mouthpieces because they were not getting traction. So there's a very popular line in Rajkumar Santoshi's representation of Bhagat Singh, in the legend of Bhagat Singh, where he says, "Agar ye Congress cheekti bhi hai, to ye chap jata hai paper mein," which is actually the case, which is exactly what happened. These people did not get money, and these were educated people who realized what kind of nonsense they were being taught in schools and colleges, and they decided to jump into this Havan Kund. So I think, I hope through Mr. Sanyal's books and others' books, their history is done justice to. This much is clear. At every stage, the Congress was pushed to changing its position only because of the extremists and the revolutionaries. But for them, minus them, Bharat would have actually seen a very clear submission as a dominion to the British Empire. That was their clear-cut goal.
So the carrot of the home rule, and this is where you have to tackle two ideas, basically gives you the Hindu-Muslim unity phase. Now, discuss in your words the rationale of the Muslims riding on this catchphrase of Hindu-Muslim unity, what the moderates actually thought they would achieve by it, And I think we have to bring in Gandhi specifically in this point right now.
Tilak, Annie Besant, and Gandhi.
Yes, you can discuss these three. And also the transition of Annie Besant from one to the other. So that's also very interesting. I don't know they worked under what pressures, because, literally the motivation of the Muslims to actually collude with the slogan up to the time it suited them.
Right.
And I don't know, it's naivete or what of the moderates to do it, and Gandhi in it. So this bit.
No, they were actually playing the 1920s version of Chanakya Niti, so I'll explain what they were doing. So there are different sets of interests working. By 1914, moving to 1916, the Muslim community here is in a fix, serious fix. It doesn't know what to do, who to support, because you are midway into the First World War. Turkey joins this later, and there are several frantic messages sent from here to Turkey: do not jump into the world war because we will be forced to take a position. And we don't want to take a position which is anti-British. It endangers our interests here and our position in the global ummah. So please don't do it. Now, Turkey has to jump into this because it loses a significant portion of its territory in the preceding Balkan Wars. And therefore, it sees this as an opportunity to get it back. And around that period is when they also undertake the genocide of the Armenian population, which is significant. All of this happens. So, European powers may have an agnostic, irreligious motivation with respect to Germany. But their motivation with respect to Turkey is the re-establishment of Western civilization and Christian civilization in those parts of Europe which were previously Christian. So, it's not as if they had a monolithic approach to every participant in the World War. Depending on who the participant is, the motivations were very different, either territorial or religious or civilizational. Now, by the time it comes to 1916 and Turkey jumps into the war, Indian Muslims are wondering what to do. The British commit a few strategic errors at that point. Even during the World War, after the participation of Turkey, Indian Muslims have a wait and watch approach. They're waiting to see which way this war swings. Let's wait and watch. There is a Kanpur mosque incident that happens in 1916, where a portion of the mosque is demolished under the orders of the local collector and so on and so forth, and the temple is saved because of the Congress's proximity to the British. This movement or this particular incident is when the Ali brothers step into the picture. Both the brothers come to prominence because of this particular movement, and they realize, you know what, the Muslim League is dominated by those people who want to collaborate with the British, but we now need a movement because we are under attack everywhere, both within Bharat and outside. That's when the movement actually starts. And then they realize the Congress needs our support in some way to present a united face to get dominion status. The Congress realizes that as long as it does not have Muslim support, it cannot present a case for a single nation, because there can't be two nations for the grant of a nation statehood. That is why the two-nation theory is so critical, because the definition of a nation state is based on homogeneity in terms of either race or religion or language. So they say we need these people. So Tilak, Gandhi, before Gandhi, Tilak has already started this movement. Annie Besant has already started this movement because they have started the Home Rule Leagues. The Bombay branch of the Home Rule League is run by Jinnah, and he was a fantastic administrator of the movement. He did a fabulous job of it. I think the man acquitted himself in every role, better than Gandhi. So while this movement happens, they then realize the best way to get the British to take a few steps back from Turkey is to participate with the Congress and present Bharat now as the bargaining chip. And then comes the Lucknow Pact of 1916, which starts this golden phase of Hindu-Muslim unity in this country, which lasts for barely 3-4 years. And this movement dies a natural death by the time the purpose of the Khilafat movement itself is rendered infructuous by Kemal Ataturk, who effectively wins the war for the Turks and also demolishes the Islamic Caliphate, abolishes the concept of an Islamic Caliphate, and the so-called Khalifa has to flee Turkey in a British vessel. That is the final insult to the global ummah, which is delivered by the British with the icing on the cake. Now, by the time you're looking at the closure of the First World War, Turkey is lost in the first round when Kemal Atatürk has not come to power. And then you have the negotiations going on with respect to territories. So now the argument becomes of the Indian Muslims, restore every territory that Turkey has lost in the war. So Germany's territories will be taken away in Alsace-Lorraine and other places. But as far as Turkey is concerned, it should not suffer the same consequences as Germany. The British man and all these allied powers say, how do you expect us to treat Turkey differently when it has been an equal participant in this war? Why should Germany and Turkey be treated differently? Then they say, okay, if that is not possible, at the very least, preserve Turkey's control over what is known as the Islamic homeland, which means Palestine, Syria, Makkah, and Saudi Arabia, which is called that's where the whole thing comes from. Al Jazeera is actually named after this. The Jazeera, because that's where you have their holy shrines. This becomes the bargaining chip. All of this is rendered infructuous when Kemal Atatürk comes to power, and then he wins back his territories from Greece and other countries, which is Turkey's territories. And then he says, you know what? The presence of this caliphate in this country is single-handedly responsible for us being constantly at loggerheads with the West and everybody else. I'll take away the British suspicion that it might lead to Islamic revivalism by demolishing the concept of a caliphate altogether. So the first step that he does, he says, the Khalifa will no more be an individual, it will be the parliament itself, which has never happened in Islamic history. That creates a huge round of debates as to how can Khalifa be an entity as opposed to an individual. And then he says, I'll go to the next step and destroy that institution altogether, and he abolishes it. Once this is done, every reason that existed until then for Hindu-Muslim unity is gone. All promises made until then are retracted. But the Hindu side continues to live by its promise. And then starts the phase of riots, bloody riots. During the period of Khilafat, it continues in Bihar and other places in districts like Arra district, massive riots that go on. They get reported because the Hindu side responds in massive numbers, which results in greater concessions being given to the Muslim League by the Hindu side. So regardless of who causes that particular riot, merely because there's a retaliation from the other side in self-defense, Congress is expected to give more concessions in seat participation, regardless of the numbers. So in certain provinces, even if the Muslim population was less than 20%, their representation in the province's assembly would be over 50%. These are the kind of concessions that were extracted. And then once the riots start, by 1924, Kohad, Malegaon, Mopla, Malabar, all these places, it's over, done and dusted. So at best, 1916 to 1924, there is no concept of a unity before or after.
And Gandhi?
Gandhi was taking forward Tilak's and Annie Besant's role in the support of this Khilafat movement. But the one thing that he does is Tilak and Annie Besant had significant political standing independent of their support from Muslims. Gandhi's rise to political power is significantly on the backs of Muslims. And therefore, he is effectively held hostage to their support to continue being relevant. And there comes a point where Khilafatist hooligans take over Congress proceedings and shut out every dissenting voice to prop up Congress, to prop up Gandhi. And it is captured in the minutes of the Congress proceedings. Now, I'm not even fabricating this. I don't need to do a Romila Thapar here. So I know for a fact, which is why the proceedings are abundantly clear. So the man, for all his professions of non-violence, was comfortable being, led by hooligans of the first order. His response to Mopla riots is nothing. His response to Kohat is, Hindus, please don't go back. Until Muslims of that particular region grow a heart and a spine and a conscience, please don't go back.
Kohat is significant because Kohat had a Hindu minority.
7%.
So while he talks about the rampant riots that took place all over India, nowhere was there displacement of Muslim population. But Kohat, where the minority was Hindu, there was actually a displacement of population. It's very, very reminiscent of Kashmir.
So British troops who were stationed in Rawalpindi cantonment had to be called to evacuate the 7% population where 93% was Muslims. And Kohat is currently in NWFP. This is the nature of the so-called Hindu-Muslim unity. By the time Khilafat is done, everybody says, so Annie Besant, who was until then the extremist, moves to the moderate side. Because if extremism is Gandhi, with the support of Khilafatists, I don't want to be on this side. Because she said this is going to lead to anarchy. Not just that. There were religiously motivated defections in the army in favor of the Khilafatists in the Muslim regiments. So the Hindu population and leaders who were concerned for Hindu population safety were worried. If these kind of defections happen and the British army is left defenseless or it doesn't have the numbers needed, what happens to the Hindu population? Then these were the kind of concerns. Then they realized that this nonsense is not going to work. Let's go back to the Tilak model, where Tilak effectively said, don't fight for a place in the bureaucracy. Fight for a place in the Imperial Legislative Assembly and be a part of the change from within the system. So he changes the moderates' approach to colonial administration by saying that I might as well learn from Syed Ahmad Khan that if I can't fight them militarily, I might as well occupy those positions and change it. That leads to the establishment of the organization that Mr. Sanyal mentioned previously, the Swaraj Party. Motilal Nehru and all these people established the Swaraj Party and say that because of the non-cooperation movement, the Congress stays out of all the elections. Muslim League is constantly contesting in elections. And therefore, for them to become part of the legislative debates and for them to become part of the policy-making discussions, they decide to contest elections. The Justice Party comes around the very same period. Then you have the Singh Sabha set up across the country, which is, as Mr. Sanyal said, the precursor to the Khalistan movement, which is where the division starts between the Hindu identity and the Sikh identity.
So I will also, he ends the book with the Mopla riots, and I will also end my last question with it, because it's only fair that they ask you questions. But the way I'll do it is this.
How fair is it? 5 minutes?
Yeah. You wanted me to shut up earlier. So
I gave you a hint. You didn't get it. Go on.
So I'm being bullied. So the thing is that this is an extract from a book on modern India by Arjun Dev. I did a Twitter crowdsource information on this. It ruled the roost of India's education system for about 20 years at least. And this is what they say about the Mopla riots. The movement was a great success. I think this is for the non-cooperation. And the firings and arrests could not stop it. Before the year 1921 was out, 30,000 people were in jail. They included most of the prominent leaders. Gandhiji, however, was still free. A rebellion had broken out in some parts of Kerala. The rebels were mostly Mopla peasants. Hence, it is called the Mopla Rebellion. The rebellion was suppressed by terrible brutalities. More than 2,000 Mopla were killed and about 45,000 arrested. An example of the brutalities was suffocation to death of 67 Mopla prisoners in a railway wagon when they were being shifted from one place to another. Full stop.
Right.
So now please show the...
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do a compare and contrast in how history is represented in this country.
And the reason why I say this is that institutionalized history books are teaching us this. This is the government of India commissioned history books from the NCERT that is doing this to us.
So here's a comparison.
Where are we to go? Yeah.
69 people get burnt alive in Sabarmati Express. Subsequently, around 2,000 people are killed in Gujarat. The official numbers are close to 900 are Muslims and close to 400 are Hindus. Nobody talks of the 69 people who were burnt alive in the Sabarmati Express. Now when it comes to the Mopla riots, we are only taught of the 67 people who were burnt in a railway wagon. How many people participated in the Mopla genocides? I have given the numbers after calculating it from at least 3 reports. Close to 49,000. 49,000 people were out with the Mopla knife. 49,000 people were the number of participants. And take it from me, This is the number of the average size of an army during those periods. If you're looking at the medieval period, or let's say the 12th or the 14th century, you're looking at 10,000 soldiers, 30,000 soldiers, and 40,000 soldiers. Close to 50,000 people were out on the streets. Caliphates were established in Kerala, in Malabar. Freedom was announced, and you had generals being established, kings being established, Islamic Caliphate kings being established, or caliphs being established. And how they went about killing these people, and the plunder goes on, I think, from August 1920 till February 1921, for a period of 6 months. 6 months. They had to bring reinforcements from Bangalore, from Madras, and so many places. They didn't know what was happening. Literally, law had taken a vacation. The British had absolutely no control over that particular period. They had to do search and combing operations for 6 months to kill them, because it's a mountainous region full of wild terrain, which cantonments, let's say companies, coming from outside don't have any knowledge of. Exactly the problem that Indian Army faced with Ulfa in Assam or in Kashmir. So for 6 months this goes on. Gandhi continues. He continues. Relentless. Annie Besant writes stinging, scathing letters. Any other man should have committed suicide upon receiving that letter, if he had some sense of shame and conscience. She details how people were paraded naked. Falsified affidavits were filed before the Supreme Court by a so-called activist on ripped fetuses about Gujarat. But that was the exact thing that happened in Malabar. This was a reality, reported by multiple people, including Muslim members of the Congress, who were writing to Gandhi, please take a note of this. I would only suggest a shortcut to reading my book. Don't read anything in between. There are only 2 chapters which, according to me, are strictly relevant. Chapter 1 and Chapter 9. Chapter 1 is how the two-nation theory began and what are its origins and how old are they. Chapter 9, the implementation of the two-nation theory on the ground. That's it, you're done. You don't need to read anything else.
Quick questions, anybody? Hands going up.
Yes, Anand, please, 30 seconds, please.
Where's Anand?
If he consumes 30 seconds in the question, it's not my problem.
That was an amazing session, Sai. I'll take less than 30 seconds.
Please.
2 very short questions. One, why do you think that this government is celebrating the Khilafat movement, 100 years of Khilafat? And number 2, is there such a thing as a moderate movement?
So I think the government is currently following the Chadar Bhejo policy. Ajmer ko Chadar Bhejo. Celebrate the Inquisitor of Goa. Co-opt Periyar somehow. I don't know what are these compulsions, especially when the government continues to enjoy the support of its core constituency. And as you said on a television debate last week, it is blessed with a joke of an opposition. So there are really no hardcore political compulsions here where there is a shrinking vote base or whatnot. So what is this audience that is being catered to? I don't understand genuinely. And coming to the second part of your question, all of us have learnt our lessons from the Nupur Sharma episode, so don't put me in a spot. Okay. All I will say is this. Computer and education will not change the mindset. I hope the government realizes that. Address the mindset head on, don't beat around the bush. Ho gaya. If the homeland, let's say, if the country of birth or the land of birth of Islam is addressing this issue head on, why can't Bharat, having suffered the consequences for at least 1200 years? I think there is a serious paucity of imagination, originality, and vertebracy on this particular front. That's all I have to say. Despite the achievements of the government on every other front, and despite me being a votary because there are really no other options, I would still say on this front, it's been a letdown. That is my humble opinion. I could be wrong, I could be trolled for this, but I will stand by this opinion because I'm backed by facts.